The Brain Injury Guide and Resources is a tool for professionals, community members, and family to understand traumatic brain injury, as well as how to promote better living for those who live with a TBI. In this interview, we will talk with Dr. Christopher Wolf, a physiatrist in the Department of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation at the MU School of Medicine, to learn some basic information about traumatic brain injury. And Chris, thanks very much for being with us. We appreciate it.
I appreciate you having me.
First, Chris, give us an overview of the structure of the brain, if you would.
Well, the brain itself, a lot of people have seen a lot of different pictures. This is one we're going to use today, but it's a very delicate structure. It's basically what it is a very soft, gelatinous structure that's kind of hidden inside the skull. And so the skull is our protection for this very soft structure. The overall structure that you'll see back here is the cerebrum, which is the bigger portion of the brain. Huddled underneath it is the cerebellum, and then there's a brain stem that's not actually seen on there that's continuous with the spinal cord itself. And those structures kind of make up the central nervous system, with the brain kind of being the computer that runs the whole system.
Mm-hmm. What's the relationship of the brain structure to the functions of the brain?
Well, we know there's definitely a connection to all the different structures and the functions that they provide. And anyone who tells you that we know everything about the brain doesn't really know about the brain, because there's a lot more we don't know than what we do know. Now, with the brain, it is broken up on this picture that we have behind us here into the different lobes. Each lobe serves different functions. The frontal lobe, which is a commonly injured structure, seats a lot of judgment and reasoning and motivation. That is a very common place for what makes us human. And what we call the executive functions, which kind of incorporates all that, is seated there. The temporal lobe seats a lot of our memories, and a lot of our ability to think is in that area. And then the occipital lobe essentially controls a lot of our visual functions and our ability to see, and helps subserve some of the other functions of the brain. And then you see that central sulcus, where we have the postcentral gyrus and the precentral gyrus, fancy terms for those little areas of the brain. But those are going to serve for movement and initiating movement, being able to move your foot, move your leg, and that sends the impulses down through the spinal cord, but also a different portion of it receives information from the legs and arms and actually allows you to feel when someone's touching you. And so those are the ones you can see on the outside. But then deeper than that, there's another layer, and the subcortical layer, and there's areas such as the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, which you can just see peeking out from underneath, that kind of modify the movements and have purposes to try to help coordinate and make things work smoother and better than normal. And those are all then connected into the spinal cord itself.
Mm-hmm. So what happens in a brain injury?
Well, in a brain injury, there's multiple things that happen all at once. Now, we mentioned that the brain structure itself is very soft and almost gelatinous, and there's different areas and different densities through the brain. So when the brain is injured, it's essentially this cerebrum on a stalk or on the brain stem. And when the head hits in any direction, there's going to be not only the impact in certain areas of the brain, usually that frontal lobe, which we talked about. Also, the temporal lobes are more common than other places to be injured. And those are going to essentially hit the side of the skull and cause bruising or contusions. But at the same time, those densities and different densities are going to rotate at different speeds, and you're actually going to get a tearing that can occur, or a shearing type of injury that can occur at different areas throughout the brain. And that's called diffuse axonal injury, giving us more widespread effects. Those tend to occur at what's called the gray-white matter junction, which is where the axons have an insulation on them, where that insulation changes. But also it can happen at some of the midline structures, basically where that stalk or the brainstem is coming into the cerebrum, where you get a twisting motion. And those can tear through the brainstem and the corpus callosum, which is our only real connection side to side, from the right side of the brain to the left side of the brain. Mm-hmm. And that's essentially what happens at that moment of impact. There are some secondary effects that happen after that moment of impact, where the brain then has a lot of excitatory amino acids, which is basically a lot of chemicals being released all at once, causing additional damage and additional cell death. And that causes swelling, which causes additional cell problems and death. So those are quite a few things that still are happening there. And then whatever is happening to that person at that time. Are they having trouble getting oxygen to the brain, anything else? So there's a lot of issues that happen with that moment of injury.
Mm-hmm. How does the brain recover from an injury?
Well, the recovery is kind of the opposite of that. And so we have all of these, the secondary effects I talked about with all of those excitatory amino acids and all the different chemicals being released. Those start to downregulate and disappear out of the brain. And with that goes a decrease in the swelling. And we will see some initial recovery just purely on the fact that that swelling is going down. And that over time will decrease some of the functional ramifications of the injury. But then after that, we're pretty sure there's not a tremendous amount of actual recovery of dead cells. Once those cells are damaged, we have to rely on the brain's healing mechanisms to essentially compensate for that.
So Chris, could one area of the brain that's damaged, could one area of it compensate for another area that is damaged?
Somewhat. They can't take on tremendous new roles, but there's usually quite a few, essentially double wiring, more or less. And so yes, there is some of that where the brain shifts its focus a little bit, but oftentimes we have to substitute and relearn and teach it. Basically get the wires to reconnect in a different way.
All right, Chris, thank you very much for being with us. We appreciate your insight.
Well, thank you.
And thank you for watching this interview on an overview of TBI, a service of the Brain Injury Guide and Resources.